7, 8, and 9 say finding the solutions in an interval for a trigonometric equation using your Pythagorean identities. So you might want to have your Pythagorean identities handy. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. That's the most common one we use. Tangent squared plus 1 is equal to secant squared. Cotangent squared plus 1 equals the cosecant squared. So those identities we're going to use and substitute in order to solve our equation. Normally we want them in terms of sine and cosine. So keep those in mind. So we have negative cosine squared of x minus 1 equals the sine of x. And so if I think about my Pythagorean identity, sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1. So the cosine squared of x is going to equal 1 minus the sine squared of x. I'm going to substitute that into my equation so that I have it written in terms of just the sine only. So I'm going to have minus 1 minus the sine squared of x minus 1 equals the sine of x. Using my distributive property, negative 1 plus the sine squared of x minus 1 equals the sine of x. Setting that equal to 0, making sure my squared term is positive, I'm going to move this over here. So I'm going to have sine squared of x minus the sine of x, and then a negative 1 plus a negative 1 would be minus 2 equals 0. I now want to factor that out. So I'm thinking of that as x squared minus x minus 2. X and x plus and a minus. I'd have to have a minus 2 and a plus 1. So that would factor into the sine of x plus 1 and the sine of x minus 2 equals my 0, smooshing that in there. So either I'm looking for the sine of x equals minus 1, because I'd have to move that over, or the sine of x equals, and that would change to a positive 2. So I'm looking for the values where the sine of x equals negative 1 or positive 2. So I'm going to grab my table, which I hid. Sine of x equals negative 1. Going down my list, there's only one answer, 3 pi over 2. Looking for where the sine of x equals a positive 2. If I look down my list, there are no 2's in there. None for that one. So I'm only going to have one answer. My only answer is going to be 3 pi over 2. Number 8, same kind of thing. You'll notice I have cosine squared in there. We know that sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1, so that cosine squared of x equals 1 minus sine squared. And again, I'm going to substitute that in, so I have everything in terms of sine. So I would have 2 times 1 minus the sine squared of x equals 2 plus the sine of x. So 2 minus 2 sine squared of x equals 2 plus the sine of x. So in this case, I'm going to subtract my 2 and add my 2 sine squared of x. So minus the 2 plus the 2 sine squared of x. So 0 is going to equal 2 sine squared of x plus the sine of x. So if I'm going to factor that one, you can see I can factor out the sine of x. If you need to, make it 2x squared plus x. Factor it that way, but this one I think we can just see there's a common factor of sine of x. So if I take out the sine of x, I get 2 sine of x plus 1. So either the sine of x is going to equal 0, or 2 sine of x is going to equal minus 1. So sine of x equals minus 1/2. So sine of x equals 0 or negative 1. excuse me, negative 1/2. And then I'm going to look those up on my table. So sine of x equals 0 at 0 and at pi. Again, it's also at 2 pi, but we're not including 2 pi in our answer. So sine of x equals negative 1/2 at 7 pi over 6. And negative 1/2 at 11 pi over 6. So all four of those are going to go in for our answer. 0 pi, 7 pi over 6, and 11 pi over 6. Number 9. This time I have a sine squared. So again, thinking about solving sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, the sine squared would equal 1 minus the cosine squared of x. And so I'm going to have negative 5 cosine of x equals negative 2 times 1 minus the cosine squared of x plus 4. So negative 5 cosine of x equals negative 2 plus, because I have a negative times a negative, 2 cosine squared of x plus 4. Since this is positive, I'm going to move this over here. So I'm going to add my 5 cosine of x. So 0 is going to equal 2 cosine squared of x plus 5 cosine of x. Negative 2 plus 4 would be plus 2. So I'm thinking about factoring 2x squared plus 5x plus 2. 2x and x, a plus and a plus, and I'd have to have the 2 here and the 1 there. 4x plus 1x is 5x in the middle. So this is going to factor into 2 cosine of x plus 1 and cosine of x plus 2. Again, you could FOIL that out just to double check it, but that should be good. So 2 cosine of x would equal minus 1. Cosine of x is going to equal negative 1/2. That's one of them I'm going to look up. And then over here, cosine of x would equal negative 2. So I'm going to look up where the cosine of x equals negative 1/2 and negative 2. So cosine of x equaling negative 1/2 would be at 2 pi over 3. Cosine of x equals negative 1/2 at 4 pi over 3. And if I look for cosine of x equals negative 2, there aren't any that equal negative 2. So I'm just going to have those two answers, 2 pi over 3 and 4 pi over 3.